But now we get a little bit of a revelation that truly blew me away. I read it like 4 times over to be like, did I read that right? Because, okay, Edwina might be hanging out with this guy, Bill Paley, but of course her heart belongs to Bunny, and it always has and always will. So don't ever go into questioning that. But even though she officially was still having this relationship with Bunny, who is now on Dicky's staff at CEAC, Bunny is none too concerned about keeping himself pure for Edwina. He's seeing someone. Guess who he's seeing? Janie Lindsay, the same woman that Dicky is having an affair with. Does Bunny just like follow Dicky and just take up where he left off? I mean, it just seems like whatever Dicky has, Bunny wants seconds. What a loser. Get your own girlfriend, man. Actually, you already have one. It's the wife of the guy that you're working for. Oh, but you also have to have his girlfriend too. Like, what is this messy little world of incestuous love affairs? Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Denise, and today we are doing chapter 14 of the Mountbattens. This chapter is called Supremo, and it's sort of divided into 2 parts. The first half of this chapter is about Dicky's job as Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia. That was a job he got through politics, and it actually wasn't anybody's first choice. So let's talk about how he does and how he manages that and what people's perception of him was. But then the second half of the chapter, we do a lot of talking about Edwina. Now, Edwina, for several chapters now, has shown a better side to her personality. We haven't seen her out just literally crisscrossing the globe with different men, which is the way we were introduced to her. And now we're seeing a side of Edwina that seems like a second personality completely. Super, super, super hardworking, very disciplined, very orderly. Whereas the first half of the book seemed to highlight her desire for spontaneity at all costs. Now it seems like we're seeing this side of a personality that actually was present when she was a child. She was a very studious type A student. And then it kind of seemed like she went off the rails and did like whatever. And now it seems like she's returning to that place. But you'll recall that in some of the earlier chapters when she was living life, largely, she had a lover who she referred to as Bunny, and the whole family calls Bunny. And he was the great love of her life. She loved him and cared about him far more than she ever cared about Dicky. And the two of them really seemed to understand each other. But tragedy is going to strike in that relationship. No one's going to die, but things are going to really go off the rails there. And she really suffers. And really the whole family suffers because she's suffering over this relationship tragedy. So that's kind of like the second half. And I think I had kind of forgotten how she was and really how both she and Dicky were. But this chapter definitely highlights the openness of their marriage. Dicky has lots of lady friends in this chapter in a way that he didn't in previous chapters. And now he's being completely open with Edwina about it. You'll recall from previous chapters, Edwina was very jealous. Whereas she could run the globe with a million different men, Dicky wasn't allowed to do that. He had to stay home and meditate on all the ways he could have been a better human being so that she wouldn't feel that she had to run out with all these men. That was his role. And now that he's like, all right, you're going to do you, I'm going to do me. That had been problematic for her. She seems to have settled into the fact that this is the way things work. So we get lots of conversation about that. But between you and me, I think the second half of the chapter was more interesting to me only because it was easier for me to follow. You guys know how I am about military things. Doesn't matter if I'm married to a military man. Doesn't matter if I've read lots and lots of histories. War doesn't interest me as much as the human dynamic. All right, but let's just go ahead and get into this. Because this first half of the chapter is interesting too. I don't mean to demean it. It is actually very interesting. But I just want to put that out there. Okay, chapter 14, Supremo. Mountbatten had first been suggested for the post of Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia by Leo Amory in May 1943, but concerns about his health, he had only just taken a month off work with pneumonia, and that he was not big enough, meant the suggestion was ignored. It was only American pressure and Field Marshal Sir Archibald Wavell's poor working relationship with the American commander of the Chinese armies in Burma, General Joe Stilwell, that persuaded Churchill to change his mind. As a side note, this General George Stilwell doesn't seem like he gets along with anyone, but anyway. The job of Supreme Allied Commander in Europe had to go to an American, as the United States was contributing the majority of troops, much to General Sir Alan Brooke's disappointment, as he had been promised the job. In return, it was agreed that the Southeast Asian post should be filled by the British. Now, like I said earlier, Dicky was dead last as far as anybody's choice for who should get this job. The first choice was Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas, head of RAF Middle East Command, but he was vetoed by Roosevelt. The American Chiefs of Staff had then suggested Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, but it was felt that he could not be moved from his command in the Mediterranean. Sir Andrew Cunningham, commanding the Mediterranean Fleet, was next on the list, but he turned it down, keen to be appointed First Sea Lord instead. 6 other service chiefs were put forward and rejected. And in the absence of any other obvious candidates, Mountbatten's name was again put forward and enthusiastically approved by the Americans, though there were still doubts amongst those who had worked with him closely. "He'll require a very efficient chief of staff to pull him through," wrote Brooke waspishly in his diary. Now, the person who got that sad job was Henry Pownall. He had no illusions about the task that faced him, and he wrote this very enlightening passage: "Mountbatten, aged 43, will certainly have all the necessary drive and initiative to conduct this war. The difficulty will be to restrain him, or rather to direct his energies into really useful directions and away from minor details. He throws out brainwaves daily, and some of them are very good too, but not always timely. He is obviously rather volatile. Most of his staff have already confided this to me, for they obviously rely on me to keep him on the rails, which won't be too easy. He also shows a distinct tendency toward creating a staff organization which shall have places where his trusted colleagues and friends can fit in. Hardly the right way to go about it, but I suppose patronage, with a big P, is bound to be an element of the blood royal." Poor Henry Pownall, what a job. Can you imagine it being your job to keep him on the rails? And the thing, too, that we're going to hear, we've heard a little bit about this, but we're going to keep hearing about it here, is that Mountbatten felt that everything required the same amount of detail. And while I certainly salute a job well done, he didn't seem to be able to differentiate and prioritize what actually needed to be done versus the small things that need to be done. I'm sure you all have had people in your life who will fixate on minor things that actually don't need to be addressed to the detriment of the bigger issues that actually need planning. And it's very, very frustrating because even though they're doing a great job on those minor things, we just have to direct our energies towards the things that matter. And Mountbatten really struggled to do that and could not be deterred. So if you were like this poor Henry Pownall, who's supposed to keep this guy on the rails, he didn't have the ability to turn Mountbatten's attention away from those small things that didn't matter. If it was an idea that came out of Mountbatten's head, it mattered and it needed to be done and people needed to hop to it. Also, the thing that's going to come up is the fact that his staff, wherever he is, his staff turns from the tens to the hundreds of people. And I don't know why he needed this many people, but I suppose since he was trying to execute every little idea that ever came out of his head, you are going to need a staff of like 400 people. All right. Despite everybody's concerns, and despite the fact that he did tend not to know how to prioritize himself, it appears that he was still the right choice. The author goes on to say that with his experience of amphibious operations and on the Chiefs of Staff Committee, his ability to work with international forces, his close working relationships with the Americans, his energy and imagination, and his diplomatic and public relations skills, Mountbatten was an inspired choice. Given the problems of jungle warfare, many of the military operations would have to be amphibious, and here his combined operation experience would be invaluable. Mountbatten knew that he was not the first choice, and it would not be easy. But he was delighted, writing to Churchill, "I have never really thanked you properly for giving me the finest chance any young man has ever been given in the war." But to Edwina, he was more open about the fact that this job would take them apart from each other, and there was some dread in his heart about that. He said, "I really don't know how I will be able to do this job without you. I've got so used to leaning on you and hearing your brutally frank but well-deserved criticism. But above all, you have been such a help with all the people I have to deal with. Wouldn't it be romantic to live together in the place we got engaged in and in a job which is really more important in the war than our host's was? Please don't think I underestimate the importance of your job. I'm just being a very selfish husband who would like to have his wife with him." What I don't understand about the way he writes to Edwina is his cowardly tone. He always has this sort of like cowering, sort of like don't hit me tone when he writes to her. He's so prolific in his compliments to her and the degradation to himself. Like, "I know your job is really way more important than coming with me, but I'm just like, guess I'm just kind of sad that my wife's not going to be with me and I got to go be by myself. And I know that's pathetic and I know I'm lame for one. No, you're not. Like, obviously, like, what kind of husband wouldn't want that? So why is he always approaching her in this sort of hangdog way? I don't know. Maybe it's because she and Bunny are still hot and heavy. In October 1943, Dicky left for Northolt for Southeast Asia, seen off by Patricia, his daughter, not by his wife, because this was Bunny's last weekend at Broadlands, so Edwina did not come to the airport to say goodbye. She's too busy hanging out with her boyfriend, sorry. Can you even imagine? And so I suppose that's why Dicky's over here creeping up to her, being like, I'd really like it if you could come. I wish we could be husband and wife together in India. I know that's lame. I don't know what's wrong with me. I guess I shouldn't want my wife with me. Something's wrong with me. Nothing's wrong with you, man. Something's wrong with your wife. And something's wrong with this whole agreement where you both have all these people on the side. Because how can you even, if you can have all these people on the side, how can you ever really expect anything of your partner? The big promise you've made each other is that you won't cheat on each other. But once you've agreed that that's fine, then what's really holding you two together? Not the kids. Y'all don't care about the kids. The nanny's got the kids. You can never then rely on your spouse to be emotional support, to be spiritual support. No kind of support can you expect from your spouse now because they've betrayed you completely. Even if you guys have both agreed, we're both going to go our separate ways. We'll be married. You know, I'm still your husband. You're still my wife. We'll go our separate ways. Once that trust has been betrayed, how could you ever ask them for emotional support? They've already shown that it's optional. Everything's optional here. So, of course, he's going to have to come cringing to her, begging for her to pay him any attention, throwing out that lifeline. It'd be really nice if you could come. But, of course, she won't, because why would she? It's optional, man. I don't feel like it. Okay, let's talk about what's happening in Southeast Asia, because it's quite dire. The Japanese had overrun the region as far as the India-Burma border, and they were menacing India itself. Mountbattens' orders were to defend India, drive the Japanese out of Burma and Malaya, and reopen land communications with China. His command stretched over the sea, land, and air to include Burma, Ceylon, Siam, and Malaya Peninsula, and Sumatra, but the chain of command had been left vague. Was Mountbatten simply chairing a collegial body of the combined chiefs of staff like Eisenhower in the Mediterranean? Or was he like the American General Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific, the Supremo with his own planning staff, able to direct his commanders-in-chief? It was a very complicated position. There's a lot of mixed interests in the region because England is here to save their Asian colonies and America is here to keep China in the war as a way of fending off the Japanese. They don't have the same goals. America doesn't care about helping England save their colonies. And so it's a very difficult dance for the British to do because they're not trying to, they've got to keep China happy, but they also want to take the colonies back. They've got to keep the Americans happy who don't care about their colonies. It's a very messy triangle here. And Mountbatten's job is very difficult. Pownall wrote in his diary shortly after Mountbatten arrived that Supreme Commander means just that. He is not just the chairman of a committee, perhaps, but in practice he has three powerful commanders-in-chief who were used to exercising power and were not going to surrender it easily, especially to someone younger and hitherto more junior. Mountbatten arrived on October 6th and installed himself in the Freedcott House, a Maharaja's palace in New Delhi, where he immediately evicted the naval and army staffs to create room for his own expanding staff. It was a portent of what to come. Many of the criticisms directed at him at the combined operations headquarters followed him. By December, Sir James Somerville, C&C Easterfleet, was complaining to General Ismay that the machine has run away and is gathering momentum daily. I feel like Mountbatten just did not know how to come into a place and not be hated. Because I know he's got all these people skills supposedly. But how do you show up at a place and then evict the naval and army staff so that you can create room for all your friends and cronies? I just feel like it's a great way to be hated off the bat. By December, the staff had grown to 4,700. Dicky insisted on duplicating everything. It's clear he wishes to have absolute control of everything in this theater, wrote Somerville to Ismay. I had a long talk with him yesterday about this. I admired intensely his enormous drive, grasp of facts, and application, but that my brother C&Cs were deeply concerned at what was taking place. He has great drive, personality, and imagination, but here lacks balance, and is a most wishful thinker. And there were the old complaints of chums being given posts. Amongst those brought out from the combined operation headquarters were Mickey Hodges and Peter Murphy, while the appointment of Johnny Paps, a former banqueting manager at the Dorchester Hotel, raised some eyebrows. Why is he hiring a banqueting manager from Dorchester Hotel to help him fight a war? Like, who are all these people that are just showing up being like, don't forget me, I want a job? Mountbatten quickly built up an appreciation of the situation, discovering that advancing British forces constantly had to fall back to protect supply lines from Japanese troops, and air supply was hampered by lack of transport aircraft. He'd identified as his priorities morale, malaria, and monsoon, of which the most important was restoring morale. So he was very good at assessing a problem and then coming up with some kind of solution. And these three things had certainly impeded their advances. So morale, malaria, and monsoon are going to be his big three, and he succeeds in solving all of them. So he begins by tackling morale. As the book said, that was the biggest issue. He made constant visits to the front line and hospitals, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles over mud tracks in his Jeep with only 2 members of staff. Troops might not believe the visits were as spontaneous or unrehearsed as Mountbatten let them believe, that his stock phrases and the languages of his command were not learnt by heart, but it showed he cared. A newspaper, SEAC, with the former editor of the Evening Standard, Frank Owen, was set up together with Radio SEAC. SEAC news stories now appeared in the British press, and film showings were introduced. More mobile bath units were created, postal and leave arrangements extended, and a program of visits to the troops introduced. One of these to come out was Noel Coward. Mountbatten lobbied Eden to create a political post within the government for the sole purpose of directing Far Eastern affairs. A brand logo was created of a phoenix, a symbol of rebirth, which the men soon dubbed Pig's Arse. When General Ronald Adam inspected the command the following year, he was able to write, "I can confirm the very high morale of your army. In fact, I have not seen higher morale anywhere." Isn't that interesting that in the creating of better morale, you would go and have a brand logo? It's like we live in an age in which the language of the brand is constantly being used. But that even back then, he would realize that to consolidate emphasis on the fact that this is a project that we're all in on together, that they would have a brand logo, and that he would immediately realize that the way for us to win is to lift our spirits first. We need to be psychologically and spiritually adjusted, and then we can address the monsoon and the malaria that are also taking us down. But feeling like you're forgotten out there in the middle of nowhere is an enormous weight when you feel like you're putting your life on the line and nobody realizes that you're doing it or cares that you're doing it. So to get media coverage about them, to send people out for entertainment so that they could be entertained, it's like all of these things to remind the soldiers, you are doing a cause for your country and your country remembers you. Brilliant. But of course, this improved publicity does serve some personal ends as well. Ralph Arnold, who handled Dicky's PR, remembered how Supremo's intense interest in everything to do with PR could be a bit awkward. As a start, he took a keen interest in his own personal publicity and made no bones about it. Too much of the wrong kind of publicity embarrassed and annoyed him. Too little upset him. It was difficult to achieve the happy mean. That would be a nightmare. Especially under those conditions, too. It's not like you have all this time to help this person's ego, and to carefully walk the line of, oh, did we talk too much about you? Oh, we didn't talk enough about you. Oh, please don't be upset. Please, man, come on. Okay, now we've got to deal with the malaria because it's serious. And this is where Edwina can step in and help. In 1943, there were 120 sick for every battle casualty, mainly malaria, but also dysentery and other tropical diseases. By the following year, it was 20, and in 1945, it was only 10. Put another way, the number of men with malaria fell from 84% to 13% between 1943 and 1945. This rapid improvement in public health was achieved by introducing new techniques, drugs, and methods of treatment, and importing some 700 nurses, which Edwina had arranged in London. It meant his troops' strength were almost immediately multiplied. The battles with morale and malaria won, the third factor would be addressed. Hitherto, there had been no fighting through the 5 months of monsoon, May to October. It's a long part of the year to just lay idle. Mountbatten decided that henceforth they would fight, giving the Allies the benefit of surprise and speeding up campaigns. Henry Pownall provides a useful snapshot 6 weeks after his arrival. And what I think is very interesting of his description of Mountbatten is that Mountbatten seems very American in his priorities and the way he carried himself, which is probably why the Americans liked him so much. And as an American, I feel fine in saying this. I think that Americans are known as hard-charging, constantly busy, maybe not always thoughtful about what it is that we are hard-charging towards, but we are doers, and we want to get things done, and we make a splash about it. And he seems, in a lot of ways, to have carried himself with that same energy. So Henry writes, "The pace is pretty hot, for Mountbatten gives neither himself nor his staff time for relaxation. His active mind is perpetually at work. Very often his push and drive are used in useful directions, but not always, and he is apt to put urgency into matters which are not the least urgent, or subjects which ought to be carefully considered. He causes, too, quite a lot of unnecessary work by not consulting his staff or asking how things stand from the staff officer concerned before pushing out a personal minute on a subject on which he is not fully informed, because he hasn't asked for the information. But with all that, his energy and drive are most admirable features. For so young a man, his knowledge is extremely good. His mind receptive, his experience of 2 years on the COS committee stand him in admirable stead. He has a most attractive personality, and his judgment is good when things are put fairly and squarely to him. He doesn't always allow time for that latter item to happen." So that's the thing. Everyone says that his energy was unparalleled and his personality was positive. It's just the fact that he wanted to constantly fly on to matters. And this is the same error that he had when he was in command of a battleship. Just flying into things that really needed to take a little bit more care. And he would just forget all the things he had learned and just what would make a bigger splash. I think that's really what he was after, is how can I make a big splash? How can I get people's eyes on me? The problem is that I think he would have been even more high-charging if the situation with China had not been so complicated. I've alluded to this already, but though China was not in Mountbatten's command, it was to play an important role in his time at CEAC. CEAC stands for Save England's Asian Colonies. You can see their objective was fairly obvious. The Americans were determined to keep China in the war as they added to the pressure on Japan in the region. This put Mountbatten in a difficult position, as British policy was to recapture Burma, Malaya, and Singapore, whilst the Americans, who supplied most of the resources, were only involved in the region as a means of supporting China. They had no wish to help CEAC, Save England's Asian Colonies. General Joe Stilwell, who was Mountbatten's deputy supreme commander, was also the chief of staff to Chiang Kai-shek and commander of the Chinese troops in Burma and Assam, with the responsibility of protecting Chinese interests. Already there was an inbuilt tension in his responsibilities, which were exacerbated by his directness, anti-British sentiment, his refusal to serve under General Gifford, the British commander-in-chief, and his plotting behind Mountbatten's back. At the same time, Chiang Kai-shek, nicknamed Kashmir Chek, simply wanted to maximize aid from both the British and the Americans and had no hesitation in playing them off against each other. It did not make for an easy life for Mountbatten. And Stilwell was very aggressively anti-British and very difficult to work with. He wrote, "The glamour boy is just that. He doesn't wear well, and I begin to wonder if he knows his stuff. Enormous staff, endless walla walla, but damn little fighting." Well, Stilwell may have felt that way, but his words turned out to be false because very suddenly there became quite a bit of fighting. The following month, there was a Japanese attack on the administrative box where large stocks of war stores had been established. Encircled, the British troops held on for 18 days, supplied by American aircraft diverted from supplying Chinese forces, and it was the Japanese who had to retreat. This first British victory was to be a turning point in the Burma campaign. But Dicky is not just sitting back and watching this from some safe point. He's also involved in not just that battle, but in others. The next month, the Japanese counterattacked the British supply bases, and Mountbatten himself was wounded. On March 7th, while driving his jeep, a bamboo stump had flicked into his face, damaging his left eye. For 5 days, while the battle raged, he was completely blind with both eyes bandaged, and he was not allowed to move his head or lie on his side. Nurses worked 8-hour shifts, feeding, washing, and reading to him, until, at risk of losing his sight of his left eye, he ignored the doctor's protests and discharged himself. Meanwhile, at Kohima, the garrison of 2,500, mainly non-combatants, had been surrounded by 15,000 Japanese troops. Between April 5th and 18th, it saw some of the fiercest close-quarter fighting of the war, and at one point, the two sides were separated only by a tennis court. Eventually, the Allies' air superiority and reinforcements of an infantry division and 30 American transport aircraft, which Mountbatten had commandeered from Chinese supply route, meant that the Japanese were finally on the retreat. So, Dicky's busy, and it was a very complicated job. So as much as people want to criticize some of his efforts, I can't even imagine trying to keep all parties happy and keep missions going and, boost morale and deal with the malaria and decide to fight in monsoons. That's crazy. I mean, it's a good idea to have that long a time blocked off when you couldn't fight is a waste of everybody's time. But he's got a lot on his plate. And apparently he's going to need to let off a little steam with the ladies. The book switches gears to talk about what his downtime was like. Mountbatten found life as Supreme Allied Commander lonely, as Peter Murphy had returned to London and Bunny Phillips was going back to Washington. He wrote to Edwina and said, "The rabbit and I parted very nearly in tears. We used to ride together every evening when I could get away and used to talk and talk and talk. I always thought I'd get to like him very much once I really knew him. And when he was with us, you will agree I didn't get much of a chance of seeing him alone." Exclamation point, exclamation point. Why would you want to get to know your wife's boyfriend? I cannot relate in wanting to hang out with this guy and talk and talk and talk. And I cannot even imagine what he's talking about when he says, "The rabbit and I parted very nearly in tears." Really? I mean, what does that even mean? I mean, you guys are like so into each other that you're devastated emotionally when it's time to be separated. Like, obviously that's not true. I mean, I hope it's not. But if it isn't, why would you say that? It's so lame. This is what I don't understand. You'll note this in every single thing we read that Dicky writes to Edwina. He says a lot of flattering things, and then right at the end, he tries to get in a barb. And that's what I despise so very much about him, because just say what you mean, man. Don't sit over here and pet Edwina and coddle her and send her all of these little complimentary things and sort of debase yourself for her pleasure. If you're going to, at the very end, try to get in a jab, just be forthcoming. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, at the very end of this, him saying, "I always thought I'd like him very much, but, I mean, even you'll have to agree, it's not like I got a lot of chance to see him alone when you were around. Since you two were goofing off, probably naked." Anyway, regardless, he still seems to want Edwina to come be with him. And when has she ever decided to show up for him, I'd like to know. He wished she could come join him and complained his hair was visibly grayer and, quote, "My middle age spread is increasing. I get tired fairly easily." She tried to reassure him, but his spirits were often low. There were continued criticisms of his empire building, especially after he moved his headquarters to Ceylon and the imposing King's Pavilion at Kandy, formerly the governor's residence. By February 1944, his staff had risen to 7,000, and soon after that, 10,000. 10,000 people in his staff? I can't even conceive of these numbers. This, together with the galaxy of flags on the bonnet of his Jeep, was all part of the showmanship, but it made him few friends. Dicky has many great qualities. Unending energy, great drive, and lots of moral and physical courage, wrote Ismay. But there's an undue amount of ego in his cosmos, and tact is not exactly his strong suit. I warned him not once, but several times of the folly of setting up a huge staff and implored him not to repeat the mistake that he had made at CCO, where incidentally, he did a damn fine job of work. He, in this respect, is incorrigible. I also told him to lay off publicity as much as possible, until he has a victory or two to his credit. But here again, my advice seems to have fallen on deaf ears. There doesn't seem to be much good in making mistakes unless one is prepared to profit by them. Well, probably he's not too worried about listening to this guy tell him lay off the publicity and all this because he's too distracted. He's too distracted by all the pretty girls he's put on his staff. Why do you think he needs so many people around? He needs new girls to look at. Mountbatten has set up for himself quite a squadron of pretty ladies who surround him constantly. This huge staff that he has, it's not just a bunch of hardworking men, okay? There's a lot of women here who are pleasing to the eye, and there was some criticisms about the atmosphere he had created. Mountbatten liked to be surrounded by beautiful women, and both combined operation headquarters and the headquarters at CEAC were renowned for the glamorous female staff and relaxed atmosphere. General Oliver Leese was shocked when he arrived and was taken to a dance at the officers' club to see a pretty wren kissing Mountbatten passionately. He wrote to his wife about the party. It was gay and full of life, full enough of drink, and very odd. Most girls were used, that's Mountbatten, and other secretaries, and they seemed to spend their time sitting on the arms of his chairs and others' chairs. One of these women was Sally Dean, then in her early 20s, whom he described as, quote, my favorite and prettiest American signal officer. Dean had been brought up in France and Jersey, and after the outbreak of the war, briefly worked in the American Hospital of Paris, before dramatically escaping and enlisting in the Women's Army Corps and being posted to CEAC. But Sally was not his main lady. His main lady was a woman named Janie Lindsay. Beautiful, tall, blonde, elegant, fluent in French and German, she had come out to join Mountbatten's personal staff at the end of 1943. She was the granddaughter of the Duke of Abercorn. Her closest friend had been John F. Kennedy's sister, Kik Kennedy, and both Kennedy and the actor David Liven had been suitors. Her 3-year-old marriage to Colonel Peter Lindsay, a colonel in Force 136, the Southeast Asian equivalent of SOE, was already in difficulties, and she and Dicky were immediately attracted to each other. It was an affair that was to last until the end of his time in Southeast Asia and continue as a friendship until his death. He was later to write to her, it was a true godsend when I found you in Delhi and asked you to dinner. At the time, in the Purdah court, the moment I touched your hand and you squeezed mine in return, a new private life opened up for me in which I could throw off all worries and responsibilities and recuperate in your unfailing love. In 2 years, we never really had an angry word. The weekends we were able to go up to my bungalow, our bungalow, at Dambula were sheer heaven, and however utterly exhausted I was, I always went back refreshed and full of courage. So he really relied on her. She's sort of like his wartime wife, it would appear. He and Bunny had attended a Christmas Eve party at her bungalow, and Mountbatten remembered, we sat till the small hours of the morning playing the gramophone and telling stories. I never realized what a relief it was to get away from one's staff, however much one likes them, and go to a private house and spend an evening with friends of one's own set. His whole staff is friends of his own set. What's he talking about? But what's interesting is, she's quite young. He's 43 years old. And this girl was turning 23 when she met him. So a solid 20-year difference in their ages. But that doesn't matter to him. The affair was sufficiently well advanced. And he gave her a present of a dress for her 23rd birthday on January 15th. They had stayed together with the Nawab of Rampur in late February, where they had visited his jewel house, an honor usually reserved for the viceroy, to see his collection of 250 radio sets. Oh, I was expecting something else. I was thinking 250, I don't know, what, rubies, emeralds, diamonds, radio sets? Okay, interesting. But maybe he was awarded that honor because who should be hanging out with him but Edward VIII? He writes and says, after dinner we sat around at the little tables in the nightclub while His Highness played the trap drums in his band and finally forced me to do the same, though I had not played the drums for over 20 years, wrote Mountbatten later. In April, he joined the Lindsays at their bungalow 8 miles outside Kandy, where they played a record of the musical Oklahoma until Mountbatten accidentally dropped it. I bet it was an accident. The following month, Janie came to dinner to meet his nephew, David Milford Haven, as I thought David might like to see some pretty girls. Mountbatten felt isolated and lonely. I have only one friend I can gossip with about non-serious matters, and that's Jane, he confessed to Edwina at the beginning of May. So Edwina knows that he's got himself a little war wife. Christmas Eve 1944 was again spent with Janie, together with Prince Philip and his new chief of staff, Lieutenant General Friedrich Bo Browning. The cook had gone mad and started roasting the turkey a couple hours too late, Mountbatten recollected, so we had an inverted dinner, with the sweet, savory fruit, coffee, and cigars before the turkey. Oh heavens, not an inverted dinner, not that. God forbid that you have a messed up dinner out on the war front. Okay, but what's going on with Edwina? Let's get on to that, because we've got we need to chit-chat about Edwina's situation. It's not good. Edwina was in love, but not like deep love or anything like that. I mean, deep love is reserved for Bunny, but he's not around right now, so she's got to have a boyfriend. So she's decided that she's going to hang out with this joker named Bill Paley, who, at the beginning of 1944, had arrived in London in the rank of colonel as chief of broadcasting. And his role was to arrange broadcasts into Germany and occupied Europe, and eventually to broadcast during the Allied invasion of France. He'd previously met Edwina when he was in London in August of 1942 to see how government restrictions on news broadcasts might affect the CBS radio network, and he had taken her to dine at Beaverbrook's country home. From February, they spent most of their free time together dining out in London and spending lazy weekends at Broadlands until the affair came to a natural end a few months later. So she wasn't really in love with Bill. She liked him, and she liked other boys too at the same time. He seems to have felt pretty much the same way about her as she did him. It was kind of a relationship of convenience. I'm here in this other country. I'm an American. I want to hang out with somebody. You want to hang out? Yeah, okay, let's do. So it's not like they were deeply in love or anything. But they didn't end things viciously. The two remained friends, and he continued to send her presents of perfume, lipstick, and other luxuries, even though they weren't really together. But now we get a little bit of a revelation that truly blew me away. I read it 4 times over to be like, did I read that right? Because, okay, Edwina might be hanging out with this guy, Bill Paley, but of course her heart belongs to Bunny, and it always has and always will. So don't ever go into questioning that. But even though she officially was still having this relationship with Bunny, who is now on Dicky's staff at CEAC, Bunny is none too concerned about keeping himself pure for Edwina. He's seeing someone. Guess who he's seeing? Janie Lindsay, the same woman that Dicky is having an affair with. Does Bunny just follow Dicky and just take up where he left off? I mean, it just seems like whatever Dicky has, Bunny wants seconds. What a loser. Get your own girlfriend, man. Actually, you already have one. It's the wife of the guy that you're working for. Oh, but you also have to have his girlfriend too. What is this messy little world of incestuous love affairs? In July of 1944, Bunny had returned to England, and one weekend at Broadlands, he broke the news that Edwina had always dreaded. Against all odds, Bunny's engaged. Oh, to Janie Lindsay? Did she break up with her husband? No. It's a different girl. Her name is Gina. His new bride was Gina, although I think in England they say Gina, the niece of Nada and daughter of Harold and Zia Vernher. And Edwina had partly been responsible for bringing them together after she sat them next to each other at a dinner party. Oh, rue the day, Edwina. 3 times that day, Bunny came to Chester Street to explain, but neither Edwina nor Dicky, back on leave, could take in what had happened. They both feel betrayed. I mean, the thing is that Dicky had made his peace with this, and he saw this person, Bunny, as a stabilizer in their family. And even the daughters, they all loved Bunny. Bunny hung out with all of them. And he was just an extra member of the family. Nobody felt poorly about Bunny being around. I think Dicky was kind of pissed off about it at the beginning, but he'd made his peace with it, especially now that he and Dicky seem to be friends. And I guess since they're sharing yet another woman, maybe this is a way that Dicky likes to live his life. I don't know. But they feel that Bunny has betrayed them both. How could you do this? How could you go and get married to somebody else? You know how Edwina relies on you. So he came 3 times to explain himself, but no one could take it in, and no one wanted to hear it. Indeed, Dicky, who had been a close confidant of Bunny, had been on the point of offering Edwina a divorce so she could marry him. He had delayed his return to Candy, and they spent his last few days at Broadlands, where it poured with rain, and she took the dogs for melancholy walks. Pamela, their daughter, Lady Pamela Hicks now, remembers, my mother took the news very badly, and there were times in the ensuing weeks she took endless dismal walks alone down the river path, when my father and my sister feared she might drown herself. It was no good bringing up Bunny's departure with her directly. She was never open to any conversation about relationships or feelings, and had trained herself as a child to be self-sufficient. How hard to be in a house with somebody who you know is hurting, but who will not indulge herself in allowing anybody else in. It's a real selfishness. I really, really, really have a hard time with people who refuse to allow other people in, though they are clearly in pain and clearly distressed, but there's a pride mixed up in their ability to express themselves. Not that they can't express themselves, but it's they won't do you the favor of trying to be a listening ear. And so you feel even more closed off from them, and they're more closed off from themselves. And so everybody's hurting, but everyone's walking on eggshells because the hurt person just won't talk about it, but they also are very evidently in pain. It's like watching somebody bleed out and they're screaming at you not to touch them. It's like, okay, but you need help. Let me help you. It's a very complicated situation. Dicky did his best to comfort his distraught wife, and he writes to her, but this is so telltale Dicky, where it's, let me pet you on the head and say all these sweet words to you, but at the very end, I'm going to get that jab in. I must tell you again how deeply and sincerely I feel for you at this moment, when, however unselfish you may be about A's engagement, the fact that it is bound to alter their relationship, though I feel convinced not the friendship, which has existed between you, is bound to upset you emotionally and make you feel unhappy. You have, however, still got the love and genuine affection of two chaps, A and me, A being Bunny, and the support of all your many friends. You have only one more bad patch in front of you, the week he gets married. After that, they will presumably live a year or two abroad, and when next you meet, I feel the difficulties will have disappeared and you'll find a new, firm, and lasting friendship based on your 11 years' happiness. Then he writes, Bunny always knew that I had accepted the fact that after the war you were at liberty to get married, and I could not let either of you get the impression that anything I've ever done has stood in the way. So just don't forget. I know you're miserable right now, but don't try to blame me for this, because I had absolutely nothing to do with it. I was fine if you wanted to marry that guy after the war. So just marinate in that for a second. It's not my fault that you're sad. Regardless, though, Edwina was touched, and she says, as well as helping so tremendously at what must be a difficult time in my life, she wrote, it made me realize more than ever before how deeply devoted I am to you and what very real and true affection as well as immense admiration I have for you. She continued, I know it is all for the best, and hard though it is bound to be temporarily to readjust one's ideas and one's life, I have always felt that Bunny needed so much of his own little home and family, and if I wouldn't give it to him, it was so important for him to find someone sweet like Gina, who would. I shall not be gloomy and silly, I promise you. I have my ups and downs, but the latter are on the ascent, and even though, as you say, there will be another trying time when Bunny comes over next, I think I can now cope with that too. It was wonderful to have you holding my hand just at the bad time. I have an angelic family and such marvelous friends, and what more can one want? One of the good things that happened here is that it did create a bit of a bond, or more so, with Edwina's oldest daughter, Patricia. Bunny's marriage had brought Edwina closer to Patricia. After spending time together at Broadlands, she had written to her father, saying, the first really heart-to-heart I ever had with Mummy. Tactlessly, Pamela, the younger daughter, had been asked to be a bridesmaid in Bunny's wedding, which is just like, dude, what? No. But Pamela remembers, my mother told me firmly, without looking at her diary, that I would be at school that day, and it would not be possible. In her grief, of course, Edwina did what she knew to do. She threw herself into work. In September, she joined a medical civilian relief unit in France, having traveled over in a converted bomber sent by Eisenhower. Accompanied by Joe Weld, part of the CEAC Rear Link in London, she inspected ambulance columns and Red Cross stores and visited welfare workers, doing her best to deal with the homeless, hungry, and POWs awaiting reparation. While she was in France, she checked on Peter Murphy's flat to see if it had been damaged, and she dined with Bill Paley. Remember, that's her old friend from CBS. And she saw the Duff Coopers at the embassy and picked up some gold earrings she'd ordered at the jeweler. Can't forget that. There had been no news of Yola. Remember Yola? That was Dicky's old girlfriend, his old best girlfriend before Janie came into the picture. And nobody had seen hide nor hair of her since 1941. But then Edwina discovered that she lived 50 miles outside of Paris. So Eisenhower gave her a car and she went out and had a reunion with Yola. All quite unchanged and as enchanting as ever, she wrote to Dicky. It's so weird to me the way they write back and forth about each other's love affairs and love affair partners. Like when they do a lot of hanging out with the affair partner while the other guy or girl isn't around. It's so weird to me how chummy everyone is. By the next month, Dicky had arranged for her to come out to CEAC as the official representative of the Joint War Organization to inspect hospitals, casualty clearing stations, and welfare centers. Her host had suggested she visit one establishment a day, but she decided that she could do two if she started early and worked late. It was here she was first to exhibit the personal approach to vast numbers of wounded men that was to seal her fate, wrote one of her biographers. She was not just another distinguished visitor. Every man, as he lay in his cot, became convinced of her burning interest in his personal welfare. Tirelessly, she went from ward to ward, shaking hands, murmuring the appropriate word of encouragement, perhaps changing a dressing, undertaking to forward some message to his home. She performed the astonished feat of speaking to every patient, every nursing orderly, and every doctor in every hospital she visited. There was an abiding impression of personal interest and warmth, and a positive electric charge of encouragement. The last day of the year was spent packing, delighted to see the end of the old one, she wrote in her diary. So that's the end of that. I am inspired by her ability to make people feel seen and to help people see that she genuinely cared about their welfare. I think it's so encouraging when we can see what that actually looks like, when we can give of ourselves and we have an example to look at, because it just sort of recharges your batteries to give and to serve others when you can see, yes, it does matter. It does matter if I conduct myself in a positive way. It does matter if I serve others with a smile and I make them feel seen. It does matter if I sacrifice a little bit so that they feel like they matter. And it can become a thing where we think, oh, it doesn't really matter that much. Who really cares? It's not that big of a deal. But it is a big deal to look people in the eye and to be listening to what they're saying and not thinking about the next thing you're going to say, but really give people 100% of your presence. And we live in a day and age in which we're so distracted. It's harder and harder to become present in every moment because, we've got so very many things distracting us. Number one is the phone in our pocket. But I love the inspiration of that last bit of what it means to just stop and pay attention to people and how meaningful that can be. All right, the next chapter, we're really going to focus on Edwina and the work that she was up to and sort of the way that she is going to continue to navigate in the world, and also what is going to happen as the war is coming to an end. The atom bomb is dropped in the next chapter. So what are they going to do now about this? And what is their life going to look like now that they don't have the distraction of the war sort of pulling them in both of them in like positive directions? All right, that is the end of that. I'm moving this week at let's see, today is Tuesday. And we've got to be out of here by Thursday. So I have lots and lots of packing to do, but I really want to make the last 2 episodes of the Harry and Meghan documentary done this week. So hopefully I can get those out to you, but I'm not making any promises because I've got a lot of work around here. Okay, I'll see you guys soon. And hopefully after this week, I can get into a more consistent posting schedule. I know the last year has been chaotic, but hoping to do a little better about that. All right, see you guys soon. Bye.